Hi guys, I decided to make this video response to Shadiversity's video on this, he calls it the stupidest ever fantasy weapon. And I'll admit, it's pretty ridiculous. Now, I often agree with Shad on a lot of the stuff he says. The one thing we don't agree on is the nunchaku. I'll just say flat out, different preferences. I don't really care so much if he changes his position on that. But, to each his own. To each his own. For instance, one thing we agree on totally is the thing he did on the axe, like why the double-sided axe is completely stupid. Completely agree with him on that one. I would even add a couple of other reasons on that because like by having it symmetrical, you don't have the weight offset. So it's actually much more difficult to maneuver it around quickly. If you think like in paintings, right? If you have something that's asymmetrical, it creates this feeling of movement. And if you have a balanced weapon completely, then you have to do all of that work. Like it feels very static, and having it offset a little bit makes it easy to swing around. You can choke up your hand all the way against it. Totally agree. The axe with two sides, Shad was right on. And there were a couple of things you could even add on to that. But when we come to the nunchaku, that's where our opinions differ. And yeah, I'm just going to say on this one, I think that a different perspective of someone who appreciates these type of weapons more and could see what makes them normally effective and has played around with a lot of different versions of these designs might have an interesting perspective on whether or not this fantasy version of it is actually complete garbage. So this idea of the like this double-ended flail, like it is pretty, like it's hard for me to not laugh when I first see it. But it's one of those things, you see it for a second, you're like, oh, that's so dumb. And then you're like, whoa, like, no. And so I want to try to giving it a fair shot. I just wanted to. My initial impression was that it's completely dumb. Now, the first disclaimers are proportions. Like with a lot of fantasy weapons, the proportions on this are ridiculous. And I'm just going to leave that out of it. So it's impossible to discuss this weapon and saying how ridiculous it is without first comparing it to an actual weapon that's the most similar to it. And there is such a thing as the three-section staff. This is a real weapon. I don't believe it ever saw widespread battlefield use because it doesn't really make sense in that kind of setting, where you're working in formations and stuff. But it was used in self-defense and elsewhere, in China, Okinawa, other places. And there's really a lot of different versions of these hinged type weapons. So being as there's this version of a three-section staff, which is pretty similar to that, we first have to look at what the three-section staff is, how it could be used, why anybody would ever want to use it in the first place, and then how well this translates over to this double-ended flail. All right, let's check it out. This is actually not anything to do with that before. It's just a comfortable hammock. I got these plums that just happened to fall here. And they're really good. I recommend eating a lot of fruit. It's good for you. Quick introduction. This is the target we're going to be using. So checking it out here. It's just a motorcycle tire cut down. I figure it more closely approximates hitting something like an arm, or maybe a little bit like the torso in some cases, like the ribs. But the old target I had was meant to more replicate hitting someone in the skull, which is very hard and rigid. It actually comes up into this conversation because the type of target that you're using on a weapon has a really big influence on weapon design as well. And here we have it. This is a three-section staff. Okay, real weapon, normal. Let me fix this on the tripod. Here we have it. So, with this weapon, We have multiple ways to use it. This is the first one. So I'm basically using it as an augmented stick. You know, this stick right here, I figure that's enough to be effective. Maybe even a little bit of overkill in some cases. But now I can use it two-handed, which means I'll have more strength, I can be quicker, and I can deliver more energy. So basically, I have all the articulation of a single-handed weapon, but I get to have the strength of a two-handed weapon, and I get to have two of them at the same time. So, yeah, it's in some ways not quite as convenient as having complete separation. If I just had two sticks, I could, you know, Kaylee Eskrima. But the advantage is I get to connect it, and I can hit harder, and I can also use it to anchor and actually be a little quicker too. First way, with the fantasy version of it, that's not going to work at all. So I'm completely missing out on being able to use it as an augmented stick. There's another way to use it like an augmented stick like this, where I strike through with here, and I'm pulling on this end as I do it. So basically, just like with a rigid weapon, it's nice being able to apply follow-through force, having it rigid, but you're working at a mechanical disadvantage because you have this short space here compared to this length here, means your force is going to be divided. But by having this connected to the top, I'm actually not suffering that same mechanical disadvantage. Okay, so it's another way to look at it. It's not a stick cut in half. It's this stick augmented in this way, doing something that you couldn't quite do with a rigid weapon. Okay. Again, though, you're not going to be able to do this with that fantasy version of the weapon. Okay, with the flail, again, you don't have the stick, so you can't use it as an augmented stick. Now, I can also use it as an augmented nunchaku. You'll notice this is much bigger than a nunchaku would be. For me to control this one-handed would be difficult. But since I can connect this way, then I have extra power, extra control, and I still maintain the full articulation of being able to move in this way without cutting through my body, interfering. Like, check this out. Okay. You'll notice on that, each time I move this at an angle which would have interfered with my body had this been a rigid stick. So yeah, you got some advantages of keeping this rigid. You also have some disadvantages from lack of articulation. Okay. In this way, I could actually do this with the fantasy version of the weapon. If I just held on to the ball down here, I could totally use this as just an augmented flail. A fantasy version, it's unlikely to be used that way in the show. Maybe they do, I don't know. But that's how I would do it. If I picked up that fantasy version of the weapon, this is what I would be doing. It's an effective way to use the three-section staff. It translates over directly towards that weapon. And then the other way, what they're probably mostly doing is where you hold it by the middle, and then you can flail both of these ends at the same time. And it's actually not nearly as bad as Shad makes it out to be. Like, it's possible to do that and have it work because you don't load both ends with energy at the same time. It's actually difficult to do and counterproductive. So try this out. Okay. And you'll notice, I mean, it's really not that different than just using like a stick. But at the same time, I can never get the same amount of full force because I can't pull this in the direction towards myself as hard as I would like this. Like, check this out. With this, okay, I'm using centripetal force, pulling it towards my body to transfer the energy into this end faster. Okay? And if I have to worry about not making this spin out of control, then I have to try to keep it more stationary and under control. Also, if I'm using it like this, a lot of times I give away my movement with the bottom end. So I want to come through here, and you'll notice that before my main movement, okay, if I don't complete this movement, that looks terrible. What I'm trying to say is if you don't complete this movement first, then it's going to mess up the main movement, which gives like a clue. Like why would I want to foreshadow what I'm going to do, right? To telegraph it. Of course, I can avoid that by just not moving it at all. But again, that limits my power. And when things get moving, it starts moving, and you kind of have to play with it. So I would say for using the 3-section staff, that's not the most effective way to use it. And if I were to be using the this fantasy double-ended flail, I wouldn't be using it that way primarily either. I would want to secure one end while I use the other. So then the question now that we run into is, if you have this weapon, which can be used in some ways like a real weapon that's not too bad, and then sacrifices other ways of using it, which are some of the primary, most useful ways to use the weapon, why would you ever want to do that? Like, do you gain anything at all by replacing these really great ends with, you have this metal sphere, which metal has a higher density, and then it's going to be in a sphere instead of a stick, which also gives it like a much more condensed geometry. Okay, now why would I want to do that? If I have it longer, it's much easier to hit the target accurately. Even if I'm off, this 3-section staff hits pretty darn hard, regardless of which part of that stick it lands on. And if you're just more accurate, it just gives you that much of an advantage. But when you're trying to aim this very small thing and it's connected by a chain, my experience is that it's much harder to be accurate with. Not saying you can't do it, but it requires more training, more skill, and there's a much higher margin of error. But does that ever make sense? Is there a reason you'd want to do that? Like, let's check this out. So when you have your mass kind of split out over this long area, right? Like here we have this metal, and if I just, kick this thing, see how that starts vibrating? Okay? This is vibrating. That happens because as it's making contact with the part of the weapon, with the target right here, okay, the target doesn't feel all of this other mass immediately, right? It only feels what's close to there. That starts accelerating, and then it takes a while for this to accelerate away, for it to connect to this, then it starts wobbling back, then it goes up here, wobbles back, and eventually you deliver the kinetic energy. But it's just done in a much less efficient way, and it results in less maximum force. So the force with which the energy is transferred is going to be less, which if you're trying to work against a target like, let's say, your face, the difference isn't going to be that big, right? Like your bones, especially more fragile ones, are going to break long before that stick is. But if you're working with a really heavily armored target, like let's say medieval armor, you have those really strong helmets and the breastplates, and you're talking multiple layers. If you want to defeat these really heavily armored targets, what you need to do is you need to concentrate that mass into a really small spot. So looking back over here, so as it makes contact with one part here, that immediately connects to all of the mass that is storing kinetic energy. So it transfers much more instantaneously. That results in a much higher force And in the case of this fantasy weapon, so it could be that the villain realizes that a more traditional design like the 3-section staff might not be able to defeat it. And in order to overcome that, there needs to be a higher concentration of mass. And in that sense, it could make sense. Like that's in accordance with real physics and why you would want to do that. And it could explain why you would want to make certain sacrifices. And then Nunchaku I took apart. And if you look, the proportions of it are actually very similar to one of these sticks from the 3-section staff. Of course, once I put it in the correct perspective, you see that it's much smaller. So we're still going to get a much more concentrated mass, but it's not going to be as concentrated as it would be with a metal ball. Okay, here it is. So I got these smaller metal bars connected to this longer shaft. We're going to try this out, see how it works. You can see I can transfer that energy from one to the other. I gotta kind of keep it moving just a little bit to keep the tension so that I have control. So it's not that I really am trying to hit with these, it's just I want to keep enough tension that if I need to move, I can do so without causing an unpredictable movement. It's kind of annoying having to babysit it, and I'm never going to be able to just generate the same kind of energy I could if I just never had to worry about it. So no question about it, this is better. And you'll notice I can actually, the weapon doesn't prevent me from doing this. I can choke it up and hold it. A second way of using it like an augmented nunchaku or flail, I guess. Definitely harder to aim compared to the 3-section staff because I have less area to work with. don't know. I mean, that's really... I wouldn't want to be hit by that. And I felt like if I had a pretty decent level of control on landing this where I wanted to. So as much as I hate it, this seems to be legit when used in that way.